There is a throne at the heart of the known universe, deep beneath a mountain range that was once called the Himalayas, inside a palace so vast that it covers a continent, on a world so layered with the weight of human history that its soil is more bone and ash than earth. And on that throne sits something that was once a man. He does not speak. He has not spoken. Not truly. Not in any way that the living could hear and understand in over 10,000 years. His body is barely a body anymore. What remains is a ruin of blackened flesh and fused bone, a figure that looks like it was carved from charcoal in grief by someone who had heard of a human being but had never actually seen one. The ancient machines of the Golden Throne surround him in a cathedral of brass and gold and humming technological mystery, cables running into his form at every conceivable point, feeding him, sustaining him, refusing on his behalf what his body has long since stopped being able to refuse alone. His eyes, if you were somehow permitted to look into the sacred chamber, where no living person below the rank of custodian may enter, if you could see past the tech priests in their red robes and the armored giants in their golden plate, and the manifold barriers of psychic shielding and physical security that guard that most holy of spaces, his eyes are closed. Or perhaps what remains of his face no longer has eyelids. The documents are not entirely in agreement on the details, as they are not in agreement on almost everything surrounding him. The sacred texts say one thing. The classified Mechanicus reports say another. The testimonies of those rare individuals who have stood in his presence say a third thing, and no two testimonies are quite the same. But whatever he is, whatever still occupies that rotting shell and refuses to leave it, it is the thing that keeps the stars navigable. It is the thing holding a tier in reality shut directly beneath his seat. It is the single most important presence in a galaxy that has been at war with itself, with alien species, with actual gods made of psychic energy, and with the fundamental nature of existence itself. For the entirety of recorded history, he is the emperor of mankind. And people have been asking the same question since the very first day of his imprisonment. What happens if he wakes up? Not dies, not finally fails, not gets replaced by something else, but wakes, opens his eyes, stands up from that throne, and looks at what 10,000 years of human civilization has built in his name, and with his absence at its center. That question is what we are going to sit with today, and I want to be clear from the outset that there is nothing simple about it. It is one of those questions that expands the more seriously you examine it, opening into chambers of implication that lead to other chambers, and then other chambers still, until you realize that you have walked a very long way from where you thought you were going, and are standing somewhere that requires you to look at the whole thing differently. The answer to what happens if the Emperor wakes depends entirely on which Emperor wakes, in what form, through what mechanism, under what circumstances, and at what cost. These variables are not trivial. They produce outcomes so different from each other that they might as well be describing events in different galaxies. So, settle in. We are going to start at the very beginning, because to understand what this man returning would truly mean, you first need to understand what he actually is, how he came to exist, what he was doing before the Horus heresy took everything from him, and why the question of his return is genuinely more complicated than any straightforward narrative of salvation or catastrophe can contain. Part 1. The man who was meant to save everything. The story of the Emperor does not begin in the 41st millennium. It does not begin with golden armor or space marines or a crusade across a galaxy that had lost its way. It does not even begin in the 30th millennium, when he finally stepped out of the shadows and began the violent process of unifying humanity under a single banner. The story of the Emperor begins in the dirt of ancient Anatolia, sometime in the neighborhood of 8,000 years before the Common Era, in a Neolithic settlement of herders and farmers who had no concept of space travel and whose most advanced technology involved the working of bronze. A child was born into that community who would outlive every civilization that has ever existed, who would watch every empire that humanity built rise and crumble and be replaced, who would carry within himself the compressed, psychic legacy of everything that had come before him. But even that is not where the story truly starts. To really understand what the Emperor is, you have to go further back, much further back. You have to go to a time before cities, before agriculture, before writing, when humanity still lived in small nomadic bands and the most sophisticated technology available was a sharpened stone. In that prehistoric world, scattered across the continents of a planet that would not be called Terra for a long time yet, there existed a class of human beings who were different from the rest of their kind, in a way that no one around them had the vocabulary to describe. These were the shamans. They were human. They were born from human parents, and they died like human beings die. But their sensitivity to the invisible current that ran beneath reality, the immaterial substrate that later ages would call the warp or the Imperium, was something that no other humans of their era possessed. They could feel things that had not yet happened. They could perceive the emotional states of those around them in ways that went far beyond empathy. They could sometimes reach across the veil between the material world and the immaterial one and do things that had no natural explanation. They guided their communities with a kind of wisdom that came from being able to perceive patterns invisible to ordinary human senses. And when they died, they did not die the way everyone else died. When a shaman passed from the physical world, their soul was strong enough and disciplined enough to survive the transition into the warp as a coherent entity. They drifted there, accumulating psychic energy, growing stronger, until eventually they returned born again into a new human body, with access to the memories of their previous lives. Generation after generation, life after life, they were immortal in the most elegant possible sense, carrying the weight of their accumulated experience forward through time in a chain of deaths and rebirths that stretched back as far as any of them could remember, which was very far indeed. For countless millennia, this worked. The shamans guided their people, sometimes directly and sometimes by whispering the right idea to the right person at the right moment. They kept the worst of human nature in check when they could. They died and returned and continued, and the warp, in those ancient ages, was calmer than it would later become. The immaterial sea had rhythms and patterns that the shamans could read and navigate. It was dangerous, as it has always been dangerous, but it was not the howling nightmare of predatory entities and divine madness that it became later. Then humanity started building empires. This is the thing that changed everything, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the foundational tragedy of the entire 40,000-year history we are discussing. Human civilization, real civilization, with cities and laws and religion and class hierarchies and wars of conquest, was enormously successful from a purely material standpoint. It allowed humans to feed more people, to develop more sophisticated technology, to accumulate knowledge across generations in ways that nomadic hunter-gatherers could not. Every advance in human history that we tend to think of as progress emerged from this civilizational capacity. But emotions have weight in the warp. Collective emotional output from billions of sentient beings is not metaphorical in the 41st millennium's cosmology. It is real. It accumulates. The fear and the rage and the suffering and the ambition and the obsession and the cruelty that are inherent to civilizations built on hierarchy and conflict and competition poured into the Imperium and began to reshape it. Predatory entities grew. Things that wore the shape of the worst human concepts, violence, rot, manipulation, excess, grew larger and more coherent as the collective psychic weight of a species that was rapidly expanding fed them. The shamans began to notice that dying was not as clean as it used to be. Their souls, reaching for the familiar currents of the warp on the other side of death, found those currents increasingly turbulent, found things waiting for them, found that the drift toward rebirth that had always been relatively straightforward was now a traversal through waters that something was hunting in. Some shamans made it back, others didn't. The ones who didn't return were not simply gone. They had been consumed by the growing entities of the warp, their psychic energy absorbed into the growing substrate of what would eventually become the Chaos Gods. The shamans looked at this trajectory and understood with the particular clarity of beings who had watched human civilization develop from its very beginning that it was not going to improve. The more humanity built, the worse the warp would get. The worse the warp got, the harder it became for the shamans to survive death and return. Eventually, none of them would survive. Without the shamans to guide it, humanity would accelerate into the exact kind of psychic catastrophe that the Eldar eventually demonstrated was possible. They needed to do something that had never been attempted before. They gathered, all of them, every surviving shaman from every culture across the planet, and they made a decision. They would sacrifice their individual existence for a collective transformation. Instead of dying and returning as separate beings, they would die together, simultaneously, and pour everything they were into a single point of convergence in the warp. Not reincarnation, but fusion. The thousands of lifetimes that each of them carried, multiplied across thousands of individual shamans, would become a single, vast psychic entity that could then be born into a single human body. They took poison together, all of them. Every shaman alive on the surface of the earth, at the same moment, gave up their existence as individuals and sent everything they were into the warp at once. The resulting burst of psychic energy was enormous enough to sweep through the daemons that tried to consume it. The merged soul that formed from all those thousands of individual consciousnesses was too massive, too coherent, too fundamentally powerful to be picked apart by whatever predators lurked in the Imperium. A year later, a child was born. He grew up in that Neolithic settlement, and as he grew, he began to remember. Not the scattered fragments of a previous life that occasionally surface in the minds of ordinary reincarnated beings, but everything. Every life that every shaman had lived, every lesson learned, every civilization observed, every tragedy witnessed. The weight of all of that accumulated knowledge settled into the growing consciousness of a child who had no one to share it with, no one who could even conceptualize what he was carrying. He left home early. He found the cities that were just beginning to emerge in ancient Mesopotamia. He began to work, quietly, in the long, slow way that someone with effectively unlimited time and extraordinary psychic capability can work. He was a perpetual. His cells regenerated from damage faster than any ordinary humans, fast enough that aging had no meaningful effect on him, fast enough that even serious injury was a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent condition. He would not die the way normal humans died. He watched Egypt rise. He watched Mesopotamia develop. He was present in some capacity for the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome, probably in ways that the historical record does not clearly indicate, because he was not interested in being recognized. He watched the Dark Ages. He watched the Renaissance. He watched the Industrial Revolution and the Atomic Age and the Space Age and everything that came after, all the way through humanity's first tentative reach toward the stars, and then the long night that followed, the age of strife that came with the psychic eruptions that accompanied humanity's first mass psychic awakening, the darkness that humanity had to survive without guidance before he was finally ready to step forward and do openly what he had been doing in the shadows for 40,000 years. He emerged in the late 29th millennium as a warlord, unifying Terra in the final stages of the Unification Wars. By that point, he had been planning this specific moment for so long that his operational security was essentially perfect. He had allies, other perpetuals who had served with him across centuries. He had soldiers, the Thunder Warriors first, then the early Space Marines. He had the Custodians, his personal guard, handcrafted to levels of genetic and physical perfection that made them individually superior to almost any other human warriors alive. He made the pact with the Mechanicus of Mars that would define the technological basis of the Imperium. He negotiated, not conquered, his way into a partnership with the tech priests that gave him access to their production capacity in exchange for formally incorporating their religious organization into his secular government, a compromise that would eventually prove to have costs he had not fully anticipated. He created the Primarchs, 20 superhuman beings of extraordinary capability, each built from his own genetic template and designed to embody specific aspects of his vision for humanity's future. And when the warp scattered those Primarchs across the galaxy, before they could be used, an act of sabotage by the ruinous powers that inflicted wounds that never fully healed, he adapted. He created the Space Marine Legions as a practical replacement for the lost Primarchs, then found those Primarchs, one by one, as the Great Crusade expanded humanity's reach. The Great Crusade was the high point, the moment when everything he had planned for 40,000 years was actually working, 100,000 worlds brought back into contact with each other. The promise of a unified humanity, educated rather than superstitious, organized rather than fragmented, capable of facing the galaxy's threats from a position of coherent collective strength. A secular Imperium built not on faith in him as a divine figure, but on the rational understanding of what humanity was capable of achieving together. It lasted about 2 centuries before Horus fell to chaos and burned it all down. The Horus heresy is a story told in extraordinary detail in the lore, and we do not have time today to do it justice. But its relevant elements for our purposes are these. The Emperor had a project. A secret project, known to almost no one, that was going to change everything. He had discovered a gateway to the webway, the ancient Aeldari network of tunnels through the Imperium that bypassed the dangers of the warp entirely. He was building a human-controlled extension of it beneath the Imperial Palace. When complete, it would free humanity from dependence on warp travel and navigators and all the exposure that came with them. Ships would not need to enter the warp. Communication would not need to cross the Imperium. The ruinous powers would lose one of their primary mechanisms for interfering with human civilization. Magnus the Red destroyed it. Not maliciously, he did it trying to warn his father about Horus's betrayal, using sorcerous means that the Emperor had explicitly forbidden, precisely because of what would happen if they were used carelessly. The psychic shockwave of Magnus's working tore apart the psychic shielding around the Webway project. Demons poured in. The Emperor, who had been pouring his will through the Golden Throne to hold the project together, was suddenly trapped. He could not leave the throne. The moment he did, the seal would break and reality would crack open directly beneath the palace. He left anyway, when the time came. He went to fight Horus. What happened on the Vengeful Spirit has been described in the most recent Siege of Terra novels in detail that is almost too much to look at directly. The Emperor held back his full power for as long as he could, trying to reach the part of Horus that had not been fully consumed by chaos. There was nothing left to reach. Horus was gone. The body that wore his face was purely a vessel for the warp's will and the accumulated power of 4 chaos gods working in concert to make it as strong as possible. The Emperor let go of what he had been holding back. He destroyed Horus at the soul level, not just killed the body, but annihilated the psychic essence, preventing any possibility of resurrection or recycling by the ruinous powers. He paid for that by receiving wounds that should have been immediately fatal to any other being alive. He was carried back to Terra, barely containing what remained of his consciousness inside what remained of his body, and Malkador took the throne one last time, held it, burned up in the holding of it, the oldest and most faithful servant the Emperor ever had, reduced to ash and bone by the act of keeping the seal shut long enough for the Emperor to be lowered back into place. The Emperor's last act of free will was to rename him, Malkador the Hero. Then the machine closed around the Emperor's broken form, and he has been there ever since. That was 10,000 years ago. The man who once had 40,000-year plans and the patience to execute them has been sitting in a chair in absolute agony, sustaining a galaxy on the strength of what remains of his will, fed by the souls of 1,000 psychers every single day, while everything he built turned into something he never intended and would almost certainly oppose. If you are watching this late at night, in the quiet hours when the rest of the world is asleep, I genuinely want to know where you are. Drop your location and the time in the comments. These lore dives feel better when I know who is sitting with them, and if you have not subscribed yet, now is the moment. More of this is coming, and I want you to be there for it. Part 2. The Golden Throne, what it is and why it matters. Most people, even fans who have been in the hobby for years, have only a partial picture of what the Golden Throne actually is and what it is actually doing. The picture that most people have is the obvious one. A life support machine keeping a dying god alive. A very ornate and very powerful set of mechanisms that do for the Emperor what a hospital's intensive care unit does for a critically ill patient, but on a cosmic scale. That is true, but it is the least interesting part of the truth. The Golden Throne was not built to be a life support machine. It was built to open a door. The Emperor discovered the device, or rather, the core of what would become the device, buried under the deserts of Asia, in ruins so old that no human civilization had any archaeological record of them. During the period before the Great Crusade, the technology predated the Imperium by epochs. Its origins are uncertain, even to those who study it most closely, though there are theories that it came from the same civilization that produced the Dark Age of technology's most mysterious and powerful artifacts. Whatever it was clearly designed to interface with an extremely powerful psychic entity, powerful enough that even the Emperor, the single most psychically capable human who has ever lived, was operating at something approaching his limits when he used it at full power. He spent years rebuilding it, enhancing it, constructing the chambers beneath the imperial palace that would house it, and doing all of this in absolute secrecy. The secrecy was necessary because what he was building represented an existential threat to some of the most powerful organizations in his coalition. The Navis Nobilite, the ancient noble houses who for generations had held a monopoly on the ability to guide ships through the warp, would have understood immediately that a successful webway project made their entire genetic gift and all their political power obsolete. The complex politics of the early Imperium could not absorb that revelation without major disruption. So, the Emperor said nothing. What he was building was a human gateway into the webway. The webway is an Eldari creation of almost incomprehensible age, a network of tunnels that exist in a space between the warp and real space, neither fully one nor the other, and therefore partaking of the worst qualities of neither. You enter at one point, travel through passages that are shielded from the warp's currents and creatures, and emerge somewhere else entirely, without ever having been truly exposed to what lurks in the Imperium. The Eldari built and used it for millions of years. It was the circulatory system of their civilization. Their worlds, their trade, their communication, their migration, all of it moved through the webway. When the Eldar civilization collapsed under the birth of Slaanesh, the webway did not collapse with it. The tunnels remained. Vast, mostly unmapped, largely empty, preserved against the warp's encroachment by the psychically resistant material from which they were constructed, a material that humanity could not replicate. Those tunnels existed, stable and accessible, waiting for someone with the capability to make use of them. The Emperor proposed to give humanity that access, not by negotiating with the surviving Eldari for shared use, which would have created a permanent dependency, but by building a human-controlled extension, a junction. The Golden Throne, positioned beneath the palace, would project his psychic will into the webway to hold the new human-built section open and to shield it against the warp, since the human-built portion used materials that lacked the natural warp resistance of the original Eldari construction. Armies of Mechanicus workers were sent into those tunnels to build the extension. In secret, thousands of workers, all their knowledge sealed behind oaths and psychic conditioning, laboring in the most classified construction project in the history of humanity. Magnus the Red destroyed it. Not out of malice, but out of desperation, using the exact kind of sorcerous working that the Emperor had forbidden precisely because of what it would do when used carelessly near the webway project. The psychic shockwave ripped apart the shielding. Daemons poured in. They slaughtered the Mechanicus workers. The Emperor could not respond. He was pouring everything he had into holding the gate shut from the palace side, and even that was barely enough. Eventually, the human extension was abandoned. The gate was sealed. The Emperor was trapped at the throne by the necessity of maintaining that seal, because without his psychic presence holding it, the gate would open and Terra itself would face a demonic incursion from directly beneath the imperial palace. So in the 31st millennium, that is what the Golden Throne is doing. It is the mechanism through which the Emperor channels his psychic will to hold a demonic gateway shut, while also being the life support device that keeps his crippled body's remaining functions from terminating. Then the Siege of Terra happened, and the throne gained a third critical function. When the Emperor was placed on the throne after his battle with Horus broken, barely alive, suspended between consciousness and absolute oblivion, the Astronomicon needed to continue functioning. The Astronomicon is the psychic beacon that makes faster-than-light travel across imperial space possible. It is a massive array located within the palace complex that broadcasts a navigational signal through the warp, a signal powerful enough to be perceived by the navigator mutants who guide Imperial ships through the Imperium. Without it, those ships cannot orient themselves. The currents and storms and spatial distortions of the warp make navigation without a reference point essentially impossible. Ships lose decades, emerge in the wrong places, sometimes never emerge at all. The Astronomicon's range is approximately 50,000 light-years in every direction, which covers the majority of the Imperium's territory. Turn it off, and you have stranded every ship in the warp, disrupted every supply chain, severed every communication line, and begun the slow collapse of an interstellar civilization that depends on faster-than-light transit for its most basic functions. The Astronomicon requires both the Golden Throne's mechanisms and a continuous input of psychic energy, beyond what even the Emperor can sustain alone. The solution is the one you already know. Every day, 1,000 psychically gifted humans are brought to the chambers beneath the throne, drawn from the black ships that continuously travel the Imperium, gathering emergent psychers, and their life force is fed into the 5 machine. They die doing this, every one of them, every day. The Astronomicon burns human souls like fuel, 1,000 per day, 7,000 per week, roughly 30,000 per month, 365,000 per year, 3.5 million per decade, 35 million per century, 350 million per millennium. Over 10,000 years, the number of human souls consumed to keep the lights on runs into the billions, though the exact figure is not something the Imperium advertises. And still, the throne is failing. This is documented in the most classified records of the Adeptus Mechanicus and has been the subject of hushed debate among the highest levels of the custodians for centuries. The mechanisms of the throne are degrading in ways that the tech priests who maintain it cannot fully address, because they do not fully understand what they are maintaining. The technology is beyond their current capacity to reconstruct. They can replace individual components with approximations, but the approximations are always slightly inferior to what they replace. The machine as a whole is less effective than it was 1,000 years ago, and less effective 1,000 years ago than it was 2,000 years ago. The trend is one-directional, and it does not improve. More psychers are needed each year to maintain the same output. The throne's safety margins have narrowed. There have been incidents classified, terrifying incidents, where the Astronomicon flickered, where the output dropped below thresholds that the Mechanicus's own projections indicate as catastrophically insufficient, where navigators across entire sectors simultaneously lost their bearing. They always restabilized. The machine always came back, but each recovery is a little less certain than the last. The window between acceptable function and catastrophic failure is narrowing every decade. The Golden Throne will eventually fail. This is not a theory or a prediction. It is an engineering certainty. The only questions that remain are when, and whether something changes before it does. Part 3. How would he wake the mechanisms of return? If we are going to seriously examine what happens after the Emperor wakes, we need to spend real time on how. Because the mechanism of his return is not merely a plot detail, it shapes absolutely everything that follows. A physically restored emperor walking out of the throne room produces entirely different consequences than a psychic god entity emerging from the warp. The political, military, religious, and cosmic implications branch wildly based on which version of events actually occurs. Let us walk through the serious possibilities, in roughly descending order of how much the traditional Imperium would want them to happen. The most often imagined scenario is some form of physical healing. The idea that the right combination of technology, perhaps something from the dark age of technology, perhaps something the Adeptus Mechanicus discovers on one of those long expeditions into the unexplored corners of the galaxy, perhaps something that the Primarchs find and bring back, perhaps something that the Necrons or the Eldari possess, and can somehow be convinced to contribute, might be used to restore the Emperor's physical form to a state where it no longer requires the throne's life support. His cells already fight the decay. He is already, in a real sense, trying to heal. If the rate of restoration could somehow be brought into alignment with or above the rate of deterioration, the process might be irreversible. The practical obstacles to this are, unfortunately, enormous. The Emperor's body was not simply injured. Significant portions of it were destroyed. Horus hit him with weapons enhanced by the combined power of 4 Chaos Gods at the peak of their wartime strength. The wounds were not just physical, they were metaphysical, inflicted on the level of what the Emperor's physical form was connected to in the warp. Perpetuals regenerate from damage, but regeneration requires something to work with. You cannot grow back a limb from nothing. You cannot restore a nervous system that has been obliterated at the metaphysical level. The Emperor's biology has been trying to perform exactly this kind of regeneration for 10,000 years, and has managed to maintain the basic coherence of what remains, but it has not been able to move beyond that. Even setting aside the biology, there is the transition problem. If the emperor were somehow healed enough to no longer need the throne's life support, the act of removing him from the throne would still release the warp breach beneath the palace. The webway gate that his psychic presence seals would open. Something would have to replace his presence there, whether that is another sufficiently powerful psyker, a device of comparable capability, or some permanent structural solution to the underlying problem. Getting the emperor off the throne without simultaneously releasing a demonic incursion directly into Terra's interior is a logistical challenge that no one has yet solved. The second possibility, and the one with the deepest roots in the lore's actual theology, is the Star Child. This theory predates many of the more recent canonical developments and has been quietly reinforced by some of them. It holds that when Horus struck the emperor at the soul level, when the corrupted War Master used the full power of his chaos enhancements to damage not just the emperor's body, but his psychic essence, the wound did not merely disable the emperor. It fragmented him. The body remained anchored to physical reality, to the throne, to the ongoing work of sealing the webway gate and projecting the Astronomicon. But a significant portion of the emperor's psychic essence, the part that was wounded most deeply, or perhaps the part he chose to release in order to prevent something worse, drifted free. That fragment has been in the warp for 10,000 years. And in those 10,000 years, something has been happening to it. The Chaos Gods are not born from nothing. They are the accumulated emotional output of trillions of sentient beings, shaped by the warp's own logic into self-aware entities of enormous power. Slaanesh was born from the excesses of the Eldari civilization. Corn grew from every war ever fought. The warp responds to collective psychic weight, condensing it, giving it form and will and consciousness. The Emperor is worshipped by more humans than have ever worshipped any other single figure in the history of humanity. Not hundreds of millions, but hundreds of billions. Possibly trillions, across the full scope of imperial space. Every prayer to the God Emperor, every devotion, every genuine act of faith in the light he supposedly represents, all of that psychic output flows into the warp and finds something to flow into, a fragment of soul that, unlike the Chaos God's substrates, carries within it the accumulated wisdom of thousands of shamans and 40,000 years of conscious experience. The Star Child theory holds that this fragment has been growing, that it is slowly becoming something of comparable scale to the Chaos Gods themselves, but fundamentally different in nature, not born from suffering or excess or rage or manipulation, but from the sincere devotion of humans who genuinely believe in something good and want it to prevail. A fifth warp entity, a force of order, or something like order. A being that would, if it completed its gestation and found a way to reunite with the portion of the Emperor's soul still anchored to the throne, produce a being genuinely unlike anything that has ever existed. The complications here are significant. The Star Child cannot simply choose to reunite with its other half. The physical anchor of the Emperor's body prevents it. The soul fragment on the throne is not free to merge with anything, because it is too tightly bound to keeping the physical form functional. For the reunion to happen, the body would likely have to die completely first, releasing the anchored fragment into the warp where the Star Child could absorb it, which means that the path to the best possible Emperor passes through the death of the Emperor. And the death of the Emperor means the throne fails. And the throne failing means the Astronomicon goes dark, and the webway gate opens, and the Imperium begins to die in real time, all simultaneously. This is the horrifying recursive trap at the heart of the Emperor's situation. The cure requires the disease to reach its terminal stage first. The salvation requires the catastrophe as its prerequisite. The third pathway is reincarnation, which is genuinely possible given the Emperor's nature. He was created through a reincarnation process. After all, the shamans pooled their collective capacity for rebirth into a single extraordinary act. The perpetual aspect of his nature suggests that his soul has deeply embedded mechanisms for finding new physical expressions. There are corners of the Inquisition, the Thorianics, loosely, though the label covers a range of views that hold the Emperor might already be working toward this. Might be, at this very moment, in the 41st millennium, being born somewhere. A child with unusual eyes and an unsettling calm and a psychic potential that will not be fully understood until years from now. A perpetual in the making, carrying within them, perhaps not consciously, perhaps not yet, the compressed legacy of everything the Emperor has been for the last 40-plus millennia. If this is true, it has terrifying implications for what the Inquisition regularly does. The Black Ships ceaselessly gather powerful psykers from across the Imperium and bring them to Terra for assessment and processing. A significant number of those psykers do not survive this process. Among those who do survive, many are soul-bound to the Emperor in a ritual that connects their psychic essence directly to the throne, which is functionally irreversible. If the Emperor's reincarnation is wandering the galaxy as a child who registers as a powerful but not obviously unique psyker, the chances of that child being accidentally destroyed by the very institution that serves the Emperor before anyone realizes what it has found are not negligible. The fourth possibility is the one that deserves its own section, because it is the one that changes not just the question of what the Emperor's return would mean, but the fundamental nature of what is returning. Part 4. The Dark King waits when apotheosis goes wrong. The Chaos Gods were not always the size they are now. They grew. Khorne grew from every act of violence ever committed by every species in the galaxy, accumulating over millions of years until the weight of it became a self-aware entity in the warp. Nurgle grew from decay and despair. Tsiench from the accumulation of schemes and the hunger for change. Slaanesh from the particular extremity of Eldari emotional experience in the final centuries before the fall. The mechanism is well documented. Collective psychic output from sentient beings, sustained over long periods, condenses in the warp into entities that then develop their own will, their own ambitions, their own capacity to act on reality. The stronger the collective emotion, the faster the growth. The more coherent the emotion, the more focused and personality-specific the resulting entity. Now consider the Emperor's situation from this perspective. He has been receiving the sincere devotion of between 100 billion and 1 trillion human beings for 10,000 years. Let that number sit for a moment. Not hundreds or thousands or even millions, hundreds of billions to trillions of souls, all directing their psychic attention, their faith, their desperate hope toward a single entity. Every prayer muttered by a guardsman in a trench, on a world that is being consumed by everything the universe can throw at it. Every devotion offered by a citizen who has nothing else to hold on to. Every sincere act of faith performed by a sister of battle who genuinely believes she is serving something worth dying for. All of that goes somewhere. And the Emperor, whatever he is in his current state, however damaged, however fragmented, has been sitting inside a psychic machine that connects him directly to the warp, absorbing all of that input for 10,000 years. He is not the same entity that was placed on the throne in the 31st millennium. He cannot be. The mathematics of the warp do not allow for that kind of sustained psychic input without transformation. The End and the Death novels, the final volumes of the Siege of Terra series, revealed something that retroactively casts a shadow over every discussion of the Emperor's nature. During the battle against Horus on the Vengeful Spirit, the Emperor came very close to something that the lore calls the Dark King. He had been building to it throughout the fight, drawing on the warp in ways he had never allowed himself to draw on it, transforming as the battle required into something beyond what he had ever permitted himself to be. The power he was accessing was enormous. It was the kind of power that would absolutely destroy Horus. It was also the kind of power that, if it crystallized fully, would not stop with Horus. Malcador, sitting on the throne back on Terra, perceived what was happening to his oldest friend and was terrified by it. What he sensed was not the Emperor gaining power he needed to survive. It was the Emperor transforming into a fifth Chaos God, one representing not any specific human emotion, but something fundamental and terrible, absolute annihilation, the destruction without purpose, the negation of everything. The Harlequins of the Eldari had a name for it, the Dance of the Dark King. They had performed it at Ulthwé as a warning and a prophecy long before the siege. The figure in the dark hood in their performance was not Horus, it was the Emperor. The Chaos Gods themselves knew what was coming. They were helping Horus not just because they wanted humanity destroyed, but because the destruction of the Emperor on the battlefield, the channeling of his full power through the medium of genuine divine rage, would produce the one thing even the Chaos Gods should fear: a fifth being of their own scale and nature, born of something more fundamental than any specific emotion, capable of consuming them as it consumed everything else. This was prevented. Ollanius Persson intervened. The emperor, confronted by his oldest friend, by the voice of the very human things he was in the process of leaving behind, pulled back. He gave up the dark power. He fought Horus with what he was left with after releasing it, which was not enough to avoid catastrophic damage, but which was enough to win. He saved the galaxy from the Dark King at the cost of 10,000 years of imprisonment and agony. But here is what the lore has been increasingly explicit about in recent years. The Chaos Gods maintain that the Dark King's emergence was not prevented. It was delayed. Time in the warp does not flow the way it does in real space. From the perspective of the Imperium, what has been prophesied has already happened. The Dark King's servants and domains are said to already exist in the warp, waiting. The delay between the near emergence at the Siege of Terra and the actual emergence is, from the warp's perspective, simply a matter of when the physical anchor of the Emperor's body is released. And the Emperor's body has been sitting on the Golden Throne for 10,000 years, absorbing psychic faith, being shaped by the warp's logic, slowly becoming something that occupies a different category than what was placed there. The Star Child is the hopeful version of what that transformation produces. The Dark King is the catastrophic version. And the question of which one emerges depends on variables that are not entirely within anyone's control. What is particularly chilling is this. The Emperor, in the moment before he pulled back from the Dark King's path, cast out the parts of himself that were incompatible with that path, his hope, his love, his mercy and compassion. He expelled them in order to come back from the edge. Those fragments are what became the Star Child. What remained on the throne is the part of him that was compatible with that path, the cold, strategic, ruthless engine of an intellect that knows how to wage war across geological timescales and has never really been fully at peace with the suffering it considered acceptable. If that is what wakes the Emperor minus his warmth, shaped by 10,000 years of torment, into something that has been accumulating divine power, without anything to balance it, then the Imperium might be better off with the throne staying shut. Part 5. The First Moments. Terra in Shock. Setting the worst-case scenarios aside, let us engage with what most people are imagining when they ask this question. The Emperor wakes, not as a chaos god, not as a dark destroyer, but as something recognizably the Emperor changed by his long imprisonment, but still fundamentally oriented toward humanity's protection and advancement. What happens in the first minutes? The answer is chaos, and not the divine variety. Every psyker within the Sol system would feel it first. The Astronomican's output, which has been a steady constant for 10,000 years, recognizable, familiar, the psychic equivalent of a lighthouse beam that navigators and sensitive individuals have calibrated their entire understanding of the warp around, would change. Not go out, not simply spike. Change in character, in quality, in the fundamental nature of what it is broadcasting, where before it projected a directed beacon through the medium of the Emperor's will and the sacrifice of 1,000 daily psychers, now it would suddenly carry something else. Presence, intentionality, an awareness behind the beacon that had not been there for 10 millennia. Every astropath in the Sol system would receive this simultaneously. The experience would range from profound and wordless conviction, a sense of something vast and momentous that they had no frame of reference for, to immediately incapacitating psychic overload. Some would find their connection to the warp suddenly clarified, as if a signal they had been struggling to read through static had suddenly become perfectly clear. Others would be knocked unconscious by the sheer magnitude of the psychic event. A few would not survive it. The custodians in the Sanctum Imperialis would know before any of this reached the astropaths. 300 of the most elite warriors in human history, individuals who have spent decades or centuries standing motionless guard over a body that has never faded, would find themselves confronting an entirely unprecedented situation. Their training is built around protecting someone who does not move. Every protocol, every contingency, every second of the tens of thousands of hours they have spent in that chamber exists to guard a passive charge. What do you do when the passive charge becomes active? The immediate instinct of every custodian in the room would be to secure the perimeter, not aggressively, but definitively clearing the chamber of everyone who is not absolutely necessary, establishing a cordon, sending for the Captain General while maintaining position. Captain General Trajan Valoris would receive word within seconds and would be moving toward the Sanctum Imperialis in the time it took anyone else to realize something had changed. Valoris occupies a unique constitutional position in the Imperium's power structure. By the ancient decree of the Emperor himself, a decree that has never been rescinded because there has never been a compelling reason to rescind it, the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes speaks with the Emperor's voice when neither the Emperor nor Malcador, the Sigillite, is present. Malcador is dead. The Emperor has been constitutionally unable to communicate in any direct way for 10,000 years. The practical authority this gives, Valoris has always been carefully managed. He does not attempt to rule the Imperium directly, accepting the division of responsibility between the Custodian's security mandate and the High Lord's administrative function. If the Emperor communicates, if Valoris has the first conversation with the Emperor in 10,000 years, the nature of that conversation will determine everything that follows. If the Emperor says anything at all, the Captain General is the first recipient of an instruction from the actual supreme authority of the Imperium. Whatever he is told to do, whatever message he is given to carry, whatever the Emperor's first act of intentional communication is, directed toward this, is the opening move in a political restructuring of unprecedented scale, and it happens in the first few minutes. The tech priests maintaining the throne would be receiving alarms simultaneously from every monitoring system connected to the device. Nothing in the throne's output history, nothing in 10,000 years of meticulous records, would provide a baseline for what their instruments are currently showing. The individuals who have built their entire religious and professional identity around maintaining something they do not fully understand would be confronted with that thing doing something they had never seen it do and have no framework for interpreting. Some would immediately reach for the communication channels to Mars. Others would begin praying. The most practically minded would be examining instrument outputs and trying to determine whether what they were seeing represented a critical failure or a critical development, because the two could look very similar on their indicators. The political machinery of the Imperium would begin to move. Whoever holds the position of the Master of the Administratum, the bureaucratic engine of the entire Imperium, would receive an astropathic transmission within the hour. Because in the 41st millennium, that is roughly how long it takes, for something that happens on Terra to be confirmed through official channels, even when Terra is where the news originates. The Master of the Administratum controls the flow of information across hundreds of thousands of worlds. The decision of what information gets transmitted, in what form, to which recipients, and when that decision is worth more than any army in the immediate term. Controlling the narrative of the Emperor's return before anyone else has the chance to form their own is going to be an overwhelming priority for certain members of the existing power structure. And below the palace, in the hidden tunnels where custodians have fought the long demonic incursion since the heresy, that situation would change dramatically in ways that no briefing document could adequately capture. If the Emperor's psychic will, suddenly sharpened and fully directed, amplified the seal on the webway gate, the pressure that has been pushing against it for 10 millennia would meet a wall considerably more solid than anything it has encountered before, and the entities on the other side would respond. The hidden war beneath the palace would become something more intense than it has ever been, because the thing that was previously a slow, consistent pressure would suddenly be aware that the obstacle it has been pushing against has changed. Within hours, the Sol system would be in an uproar. Within days, fragmentary transmissions would be traveling the astropathic chains to every corner of the Imperium. Within weeks, the political and religious and military implications would be impossible for any institution to ignore. The first moments of the Emperor's waking would not feel like salvation. They would feel like the beginning of the most consequential crisis in the history of the Imperium, one that, unlike most crises, could not be addressed with more firepower. Part 6. The Ecclesiarchy 10,000 Years of Wrong. Of all the institutions that would be convulsed by the Emperor's return, the Ecclesiarchy faces the most existential crisis. Not the most immediate physical danger the custodians and the military structures face that. Not the most complex political problem the High Lords face that. but the most fundamentally destabilizing challenge to what they are and why they exist. The ecclesiarchy, formally the Adeptus Ministorum, informally the Church of the Emperor, is the largest institution in human history by almost every measure. It has more members than any army. It has more buildings than any government bureaucracy. Its reach extends to literally every inhabited world in the Imperium, not as a presence among many, but as the mandatory organizing principle of spiritual life. Heresy against the imperial cult is not merely illegal. It is prosecutable by death on worlds where the Adeptus Arbites operate effectively, and by mob violence, or worse, on worlds where they do not. The entire institutional structure rests on a claim that the Emperor's own documented history makes untenable, that he is a god who wills the worship of his followers. The Emperor did not want to be worshipped. This is not a matter of interpretation. It is explicit. He punished his Primarch Lorgar, one of his sons, a being he had created with his own genetic material and raised as a beloved weapon, with the most humiliating chastisement available to him, because Lorgar had spent years building temples and writing theological texts in the Emperor's honor. The Emperor assembled Lorgar's entire legion in the ruins of one of those temples, publicly stripped them of their honors, and forced them to kneel in the rubble of what they had built. The message could not have been clearer. The doctrine of the imperial truth was anti-religious in its foundations. Science, reason, the clear-eyed understanding of the universe's actual nature, without the distorting lens of superstition or faith. Humanity was supposed to grow past gods, was supposed to understand the warp and its entities for what they were, not divine beings worthy of worship, but psychic phenomena, dangerous and powerful, but neither supernatural in the transcendent sense nor deserving of devotion. The Emperor was explicit about this because he understood, better than anyone alive, what happened when humans gave their devotion to things that fed on it. The ecclesiarchy that exists in the 41st millennium is the direct descendant of the cult that Lorgar started. The Lectitio Divinitatis, the theological text that Lorgar wrote proclaiming the Emperor divine, the text the Emperor forced him to stop distributing, became the foundational scripture of a religion that now covers 100,000 worlds and has been the official state religion of the Imperium for 8,000 years. This is the bitterest of ironies, in a setting that runs on bitter ironies. The Emperor was so furious at Lorgar for worshipping him that he drove Lorgar to chaos, and the direct consequence of that chain of events was the Horus Heresy, which crippled the Emperor and left him unable to prevent the religion Lorgar had started from eventually becoming mandatory across human civilization. An emperor who wakes has to make a choice about this immediately, because there is no neutral position. If he accepts the ecclesiarchy, if he looks at what it has become and decides that the pragmatic reality of 10,000 years of institutional development cannot be simply reversed, that the faith genuinely does things the secular model could not, that the Sisters of Battle and the mass devotion and the cultural cohesion that the Church provides are too valuable to destroy, then he is accepting something that directly contradicts what he built and what he died, trying to preserve. He is acknowledging that his own murder and subsequent 10,000-year imprisonment produced a world that worked better, in certain ways, by organizing around his involuntary martyrdom than his original secular vision could have achieved. This would require a level of philosophical flexibility that the Emperor we see in the Horus Heresy novels does not obviously possess. If he rejects it, if the Emperor sees the ecclesiarchy for what it is, and does what his actual historical character would suggest he do, then he dismantles, or attempts to dismantle, the single most powerful social institution in the history of humanity, which is also the institution that gives hundreds of billions of people their primary source of meaning, community, moral framework, and reasons to keep functioning in a universe that is almost unlivably terrible. The social consequences of this dismantling would be catastrophic, in ways that might kill more people than the enemies the faith was supposed to help fight. And there is a third complication that makes the choice even more complex. The Emperor's secular vision was built on the understanding that the warp's entities are not gods but psychic phenomena. He was right about their nature. He was wrong about what follows from that. The faith of trillions of humans genuinely does something in the warp. The Sisters of Battle genuinely manifest miraculous effects through devotion that have no equivalent in secular alternatives. The collective psychic weight of humanity's worship is not nothing. It is the thing that has been feeding the Star Child for 10,000 years, building a counterweight to chaos. Take that away, and you might remove the mechanism of humanity's psychic survival. The Emperor, waking to this reality, would be confronting proof that his own murder was necessary for his plan to work, that the secular Imperium he wanted to build would not have produced the psychic mass that the religious Imperium accumulated, that the ecclesiarchy, for all its corruptions and abuses, accidentally solved a problem he had not known how to solve. This is the kind of information that would test anyone's fundamental assumptions about themselves and their vision, even someone with 40,000 years of experience and the accumulated wisdom of thousands of shamans. The ecclesiarchy would not simply wait to be evaluated, of course. The moment word of the Emperor's waking spread to the ecclesiarch, which would happen quickly, because the Church has informants everywhere, and the astropathic signals coming out of the Sol system would be unmistakable to any sufficiently sensitive receiver. The institution would begin mobilizing its considerable resources toward a single goal, managing the Emperor's return in ways that preserved as much of the Church's authority as possible. The most sophisticated and cynical members of the ecclesiarchal hierarchy would immediately understand that the single greatest threat to their institutional existence was not the Emperor's displeasure, but the possibility that his presence would make him redundant as a theological symbol. A dead martyr on a golden throne, worshipped from an infinite distance, can be made to mean whatever the living priests need him to mean. A present and active emperor who has actual opinions is incomparably more difficult to work with. Watch for a faction within the Church that declares the awakened entity a false emperor. Not necessarily because they believe it, but because it is the play that preserves their position. The false emperor narrative, the claim that what appears to have woken is a daemon of the warp wearing the emperor's face, a deception aimed at corrupting the faithful, would find genuine believers because the warp genuinely does produce such deceptions. And because 10,000 years of doctrine cannot be undone by an announcement, and because there would absolutely be powerful people with overwhelming incentive to ensure that the narrative of deception spread faster than the alternative. The civil war within the ecclesiarchy would be one of the quieter but more sustained crises following the Emperor's return, and its consequences would ripple across every world where faith in the God Emperor forms the backbone of social order. Part 7. The Political Earthquake, High Lords, and Power. The governance of the Imperium rests on a fiction that has been operational for 10,000 years. Every decision made by the High Lords of Terra, every law enacted, every military campaign launched, every execution ordered, carries the weight of the Emperor's authority because it is done in his name, with his implicit sanction, as an expression of his divine will, as interpreted by the individuals who currently hold the relevant positions. The Emperor has not communicated his will directly in 10,000 years. He has not approved or disapproved of anything. The entire edifice of imperial governance is built on the practical understanding that the Emperor cannot object to whatever is done in his name, and that the individuals who hold positions in his administrative structure are therefore free to interpret his will in whatever way best serves their institutional interests. An awake emperor who has opinions would collapse this instantly. Think about what it means for each major power center. The High Lords of Terra, the 12 most powerful individuals in the Imperium, hold their positions because they represent the most powerful organizations in human government. The Master of the Administratum runs the bureaucracy that keeps the Imperium's day-to-day operations functioning across 100,000 worlds. The Fabricator General of Mars controls the Adeptus Mechanicus, which controls the production of all significant military hardware and advanced technology in the Imperium. The Ecclesiarch speaks, theoretically, for the religious devotion of trillions. The Grand Master of the Officio Assassinorum controls the most precisely lethal organization in human history. The inquisitorial representative speaks for an organization whose authority to investigate and eliminate threats to the Imperium gives it a license that effectively operates outside all other legal frameworks. Each of these individuals has accumulated their position through a combination of institutional power, personal capability, political maneuvering, and in some cases, centuries of rejuvenat-supported survival in a political environment that is lethal to the naive or the unlucky. The political history of the High Council is a history of assassination, manufactured crises, blackmail, proxy wars, and the kind of strategic patience that comes from having decades or centuries to execute a plan. Not one of them got where they are by being the kind of person who gives up power easily when asked nicely. The first order of business for every High Lord, upon receiving confirmation of the Emperor's waking, would not be organizing a celebration. It would be evaluating the threat to their own position. Who controls access to the Emperor? Who gets to be in the room when he speaks? Whose interpretation of his words becomes the official record? Who manages communications from Terra to the rest of the Imperium in the hours and days immediately following, when every transmission can be shaped, delayed, or selectively edited to serve particular interests? The Adeptus Mechanicus would occupy a uniquely powerful position in the immediate aftermath because they know more about the Golden Throne than anyone else, and the transition from a failing life support machine to whatever the throne becomes when its primary function changes is something only they can manage. Their leverage in negotiations about the post-waking Imperium would be extraordinary. The Fabricator General would understand this with perfect clarity and would not waste a moment in deploying it. The Navis Nobilite, the ancient noble houses who provide the navigators that guide Imperial ships through the warp, would face an existential question. If the Emperor's waking enables some form of the Webway project to be revived, their entire genetic gift and all the political and economic power that flows from their monopoly on warp navigation becomes potentially obsolete. They would be in meetings about this before the astropathic confirmation of the event had finished arriving at their stations. The Inquisition, the entity that exists to root out heresy and threats to the Imperium from within, would be divided immediately. Parts of it would treat the Emperor's waking as exactly the kind of event they were always theoretically supposed to protect, the return of the Master, to be supported and facilitated. Other parts, those whose institutional identity has been built around a specific interpretation of the Emperor's will that may not survive contact with the Emperor's actual opinions, would have complex reactions that could range from genuine confusion to active opposition. And then there is Roboute Guilliman, Part 8, the Primarch's Returned Sons and Fathers. Guilliman has already experienced one reunion with his father, and it was one of the most emotionally complicated moments in recent lore. When he was resurrected from his 10,000-year healing stasis and eventually brought before the Golden Throne, still occupied by what had appeared to be a silent, motionless ruin, something passed between them. What was said in that chamber, Guilliman has never repeated to anyone. He described the experience as receiving all the enlightenment he required, and then declined all further inquiry. What is documented is what came after. Guilliman emerged from that meeting looking like a man who had been told something that made sense of everything, and was also profoundly difficult to accept. He threw himself into the Indomitus crusade with an intensity that some observers read as duty, and others read as a man keeping himself too busy to dwell on things he cannot change. He has been reforming the Imperium with the energy of someone who understands that the window for reform may be shorter than anyone wants to admit. Guilliman's reaction to his father, truly waking, truly communicating, truly present in a way that goes beyond the silent and indirect interactions they have had through the medium of the throne's failing connection, would be enormously complex. He would be relieved in the way that someone who has been carrying an impossible burden alone for decades would be relieved to have the person who should have been sharing it finally present. He would be frustrated because 10,000 years of damage was done to the Imperium, in part because the person responsible for that Imperium was unavailable to manage it. He would have questions, very specific, important questions about decisions the Emperor made that Guilliman has spent his returned existence trying to understand without the benefit of being able to ask. He would also, and this is worth noting, be skeptical in a characteristically disciplined way. Guilliman is the most pragmatic of the Primarchs. He knows what chaos produces in the way of deceptions. He knows what a sufficiently powerful warp entity could do in terms of appearing to be something it is not. He would demand verification, not because he doubts what seems to have happened, but because he has seen too many things that seemed one way turn out to be another, and the consequences of being wrong, in this particular instance, would be so severe that caution is the only rational response. Lion L. Johnson, the Dark Angel's Primarch, has returned to active status in the more recent lore. His situation has always been complicated by the legacy of the fallen, the Dark Angels, who turned against their legion during the heresy, some of whom are genuinely irredeemable, and some of whom are more ambiguous than the official account suggests. The Emperor's return would, among many other things, prompt a conversation about the fallen that the Dark Angels chapter has been desperately avoiding for 10,000 years. An emperor who wakes and asks what happened with the First Legion is an emperor who is going to receive an answer that the Dark Angels have historically preferred not to give. The question of other Primarchs is one that the lore has been teasing for years. Rogel Dorn's death is uncertain enough that his return has always been possible in the narrative. Jagatai Khan disappeared into the webway, and an emperor who potentially has renewed access to the webway might have a mechanism for making contact with a son who has been lost in that network for millennia. Vulcan, as a perpetual who literally cannot die, is somewhere in the galaxy right now, and the Emperor's psychic call at full strength would be something that Vulcan, whose bond with his father was always one of the most genuine and straightforward of the Primarchs' relationships, would feel clearly. The dynamic between a returned Emperor and multiple returned Primarchs would create something the Imperium has never had to manage: a group of superhuman individuals with legitimate authority and massive military capability, and their own distinct visions for what the Imperium should be, all operating in close proximity and potentially in tension with both each other and the existing administrative structures that were built to function without them. Guilliman has already demonstrated that the Primarch's return creates friction. His relationship with the High Lords has been contentious from the moment of his resurrection, with various lords working to manage him, work around him, or use his authority for their own ends, while appearing to cooperate. Add more Primarchs to that dynamic, and you have a political chemistry that produces either the most effective governance humanity has ever seen, or a civil war, and possibly both in sequence. Part 9. What the Emperor sees. Eventually, after the chaos of the first responses has passed, and some measure of stability has been established, there is a moment that might be the most quietly devastating element of this entire scenario. The Emperor looks around and sees what has been built in his name. He was last genuinely present and cogent as a decision-making entity in the 31st millennium. The Imperium he knew was fresh from the Great Crusade. It was harsh and brutal in ways that he had chosen, and ways that were simply necessary, but it was moving toward something. The secular vision of humanity, guided by reason and the genuine understanding of its own nature, freed from superstition by knowledge, organized by competent administration, and defended by the extraordinary military capability he had spent 40,000 years building toward. In the 41st millennium, he opens his eyes metaphorically or literally, depending on the mechanism of his return, and finds a theocracy. The doctrine of the imperial truth has been illegal for 8,000 years. The Adeptus Ministorum has decreed it heretical to deny the Emperor's divinity. Billions of priests minister to trillions of worshippers across a galaxy whose understanding of the Emperor is mediated entirely by a religious institution that exists to serve the institution as much as it serves whatever the Emperor actually represented. The daily 1,000 psyker sacrifice that sustains the throne has been ritualized into a religious ceremony. The Space Marines, who were supposed to be humanity's rational guardians, have their own religious practices and chapters full of deeply held spiritual convictions. The Adeptus Mechanicus worships a machine god and relates to the Emperor through the lens of their own theological framework. Everywhere he looks, he would find the superstition he fought against and the religion he punished his own son for starting. He would also find the Inquisition, the organization he planted the seeds of the knight-errant program that Malcador established to fight the threat of chaos from within the Imperium, which eventually became the Grey Knights, and the broader inquisitorial apparatus has grown into something that is simultaneously one of the most necessary institutions in the Imperium and one of the most prone to the exact kind of unchecked power that produces atrocities. The Inquisition has the authority to destroy entire worlds on the judgment of a single inquisitor. This power has been used in genuine service to humanity. It has also been catastrophically abused in ways that made the very threat the Inquisition exists to fight look almost preferable to some of those who suffered under inquisitorial excess. He would find the High Lords and their 10,000 years of political history, and the documented evidence of what that history produced. multiple civil wars, a period when the entire High Council was replaced with assassins' puppets, a phase when a single corrupt official became absolute tyrant of the Imperium for decades before being brought down in blood, the endless grinding corruption that the Administratum codifies and perpetuates with the tireless efficiency of a machine designed to preserve the status quo. He would find that the galaxy is considerably worse than it was when he last properly assessed it. The Eye of Terror is larger. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, now divides the galaxy in two. The Necrons have awakened. The Tyranids are coming from outside the galaxy in waves, each one larger than the last. Chaos has had 10,000 years of uncontested victories, not absolute victories, but the kind of grinding attrition victories that serve its purposes perfectly. Every world that fell, every population consumed, every soul taken, all of it fed the ruinous powers. This is the reality the Emperor would need to process, not as an abstract strategic problem, but as the direct consequence of his own decisions and their interaction with 10,000 years of subsequent events. The Horus Heresy was not simply what Horus did. It was the product of decisions the Emperor made to keep the Webway project secret, to mishandle the relationship with Magnus, to underestimate what Chaos was doing to his sons, to prioritize the speed of the Great Crusade over the depth of its cultural integration. He would not be able to look at the 41st millennium and pretend his choices bore no relationship to what it had become. The Emperor is not a being who indulges in self-pity. The character we see throughout the Horus Heresy novels is one of cold pragmatism and extraordinary willpower, and the particular kind of determination that comes from having a goal so enormous that it simply cannot be allowed to be deterred by obstacles, however terrible. But there is a difference between not indulging in self-pity and not feeling the weight of what has been lost. He would feel it. Whatever emotions remain accessible to him after 10,000 years of silent suffering, the sight of what his dream became would be one of the hardest things he has ever had to look at. 40,000 years of careful work ended by his own miscalculations, 10,000 more of damage in the gap. And now an Imperium that needs him desperately, but has grown so dependent on his absence as an organizing principle that his presence is itself a destabilizing force. Part 10. The Galaxy Responds. The Emperor's return would not be a human event, contained within the politics of the Imperium. It would be a cosmic event, and the non-human inhabitants of the galaxy would respond in ways as varied as their natures allow. The Chaos Gods would react immediately, though not identically. Khorne, the Blood God, has the simplest relationship with the Emperor. The Emperor represents ordered, purposeful violence, violence in service of a higher goal, disciplined and directed. This resonates with certain aspects of Khorne's nature while being antithetical to others. Khorne appreciates strength and respects power, but his preference is for carnage without higher organization, violence as an end in itself rather than a means. An emperor at full power would represent one of the few presences in the galaxy that Khorne would treat as a worthy opponent rather than simply a target. His champions would be directed toward Terra immediately, not out of fear, but out of the warrior's instinct to test strength against strength. Tzeentch, the architect of fate, would experience something that functions for him as joy. The changer of ways thrives on change, on the unexpected, on the long game playing out in ways that no individual predicted. An emperor who wakes after 10,000 years and disrupts every established power structure simultaneously is precisely the kind of event that Tzeentch's schemes have been building toward, not because any individual scheme required it, but because the disruption itself is what Tzeentch feeds on. The galaxy in flux is better for Tzeentch than any specific stable outcome. Nurgle, the Lord of Decay, would view the development through the lens of his particular philosophy. Everything decays. Everything passes. The Emperor has been decaying for 10,000 years, and the process that decay began cannot be fully reversed. Whether the Emperor wakes now or not, whether he achieves something magnificent or terrible or merely complicated, Nurgle can wait. His contentment is not disturbed by temporary reversals of his work. He has time. Slaanesh would want the Emperor's soul. The Prince of Pleasure, who fed on the Eldar civilization's excesses until the feeding broke reality, would recognize in the Emperor a psychic presence of extraordinary richness, not just the raw power, which is immense, but the accumulated weight of experience across 40-plus millennia of an existence that has touched every extreme of human possibility, Slaaneish's creatures would pursue the Emperor's released soul with the relentless desire that is their primary characteristic. Abaddon the Despoiler would mobilize the Black Legion. For 10,000 years, the War Master of Chaos has been conducting the long war 13 Black Crusades, each one more dangerous than the last, the most recent having destroyed the fortress world of Cadia and torn the Great Rift open across the galaxy. He has defined his entire existence by opposition to the Imperium and to what the Emperor represents. The Emperor's return would be the most significant event of that long war, and Abaddon would respond to it with everything he has, because the alternative is accepting that 10,000 years of war might have produced an outcome he is not in a position to control. The Aeldari's response would be complex and factionalized. The craft world Aeldari have farseers who have spent centuries mapping the strands of the future, trying to find paths through the catastrophe they know is coming. Some of those paths involve the Emperor's return. Exactly what role the Emperor is supposed to play in those futures varies by seer and by craft world, and the Aeldari are not united in their prescient understanding any more than they are united in their politics. Some would offer assistance. Others would oppose the specific mechanism of return if they saw it producing an outcome they considered worse than the current situation. The Ynnari, the faction of Aeldari who follow Ennead, their own nascent god of the dead, who was born from the Aeldari souls preserved in the craft world's infinity circuits, would see the Emperor's return as potentially catalytic for their own aims. If the Emperor emerges as something like the fifth good warp entity the Star Child theory describes, the interaction between that being and Ynnid might produce something that addresses the Slaanesh problem in ways that neither could accomplish alone. Some Ynnari would actively seek to facilitate and shape the Emperor's return for this reason. The Necrons are the great wild card. These ancient beings who ruled the galaxy 60 million years before humanity became a species have their own view of cosmic power that is entirely independent of the warp's logic. The Silent King, who has returned to the galaxy specifically because of the Tyrannid threat, has demonstrated a willingness to cooperate with other species against common enemies. An emperor who understands the galaxy's full scope of threats and who is capable of genuine strategic thought might be someone the Silent King could engage with as a peer, or might not. Necron motivations are their own. The Tyrannids would respond to the Emperor's psychic presence with pure biological instinct, which is actually one of the most immediate practical problems. The hive mind, which perceives the galaxy through the constant psychic feed of its trillions of organisms, already views the Astronomicon as a navigational beacon pointing toward Terra. An emperor operating at full psychic strength would be visible to hive mind tendrils across vastly greater distances, and the Tyrannid's response to encountering something of that psychic magnitude is to direct resources toward it with the overwhelming aggression of a predator that has never in its evolutionary history encountered something strong enough to be a genuine threat. Every hive fleet with any proximity to the Sol system would feel it and redirect toward the signal. The Tyrannid assault on Terra, if the Emperor's return is anything like as psychically visible as the lore suggests it would be, would potentially arrive faster and in greater force than anything humanity has faced from that direction to date. Part 11. 3 Emperors, 3 Futures. Let us take a step back from the tactical and political specifics and think about the most fundamental question of all. What kind of emperor actually wakes? The lore gives us at least 3 genuinely different answers, and they produce outcomes so different from each other that they might as well be stories about completely different events. The first emperor is the one that the Imperium prays for, the Savior. The being that emerges when the Star Child, that fragment of soul containing the Emperor's hope, his love, his mercy, everything he cast away during the Siege of Terra to avoid becoming the Dark King, successfully reunites with the portion of the Emperor that has survived on the throne. This version would be whole in a way that the Emperor was not even before the heresy, because the act of casting those qualities away and having them survive in the warp for 10,000 years would have purified and strengthened them in the way that all things grown in adversity are stronger than things grown in the family. Comfort. This emperor would remember what he was fighting for. Not just the strategic objective of human survival, but the actual humans, the individual people, the reasons those people were worth the cost of everything that was sacrificed to protect them. He would look at the ecclesiarchy and see both its failures and its achievements with clear eyes, and he would make decisions about it that balanced both instead of reacting to one without accounting for the other. He would see Guilliman and feel something real about the son who held the line for 10,000 years with less than he deserved to work with. He would look at the Primarchs who survived and feel the weight of what happened to the ones who didn't. He would be, in other words, the emperor that humanity needs rather than the emperor that humanity made, which means he would still be extremely demanding, still hold humanity to standards that most individuals and institutions would find impossibly high, still be willing to make decisions that looked brutal from the outside, because the cost of softer alternatives was higher in the long run. But he would make those decisions with full awareness of the human cost, and that awareness would shape the decisions themselves. The practical implications for the galaxy are still chaotic. The transition period during which the throne fails or is decommissioned or replaced, during which the Astronomican's management changes, during which the Webway Gate gets a permanent solution is enormously dangerous. The political chaos is real, and it kills people. The religious civil war within the ecclesiarchy is real, and it kills people. The military response of chaos is real, and it kills people. But on the other end of it, there is a version of the Imperium that actually functions as what it was supposed to be, not perfect. Nothing in the 41st millennium is perfect, but better, genuinely better in the direction the Emperor intended. The second Emperor is the one who wakes with only part of himself. In this scenario, the Star Child has not reunited with the remnant on the throne. What wakes is the part of the Emperor that survived on the throne, the cold, strategic, suffering, endlessly patient component that was capable of holding the Webway Gate shut for 10 millennia through sheer force of will. This version has all of the Emperor's power, all of his strategic genius, all of his knowledge of the galaxy and its threats and what needs to happen to address them. None of the warmth. The warmth was cast away. It is floating in the warp, growing slowly. The thing on the throne never cast out the cold. The cold is what remained. This emperor would solve the Imperium's problems with the efficiency of a machine designed exclusively for optimization. The ecclesiarchy would be dissolved, immediately, not because of careful consideration of its social role, but because its foundational premise conflicts with operational reality, and it therefore needs to go. The High Lords would be restructured, the corruption cleaned out, the inefficiencies addressed not through the political process that Guilliman has been trying to navigate, but through the application of authority so absolute that negotiation is simply not the operative framework. The Long War would be prosecuted with a ruthlessness that makes the Great Crusade look hesitant. This emperor saves the Imperium. He saves humanity. He addresses the Tyranid threat, the Chaos incursion, the Necron awakening, all of it, with the cold mathematical certainty of a being for whom these are optimization problems, with known solutions that simply require resources and will. The humanity that comes out the other side of this salvation is safe. It is also not the humanity the Emperor before the heresy was trying to create. The Warm Emperor wanted a humanity that could eventually govern itself, that was growing toward the kind of psychic and moral maturity that would allow it to stand on its own. The Cold Emperor would produce a humanity that was protected and organized and capable, but fundamentally shaped by an authority that does not trust it with too much independence. Whether that is better or worse than the current situation depends on your values. Whether it is better or worse than the first scenario is clearer. The third Emperor is the Dark King. We have already spent time with him. We will not repeat it except to say this. The Chaos Gods are genuinely concerned about this outcome. That fact alone should tell you what you need to know about its nature. When the beings who represent the worst impulses of sentient life across a galaxy are worried about something becoming real, that something is in a category beyond what the ordinary scales of good and bad can measure. Part 12. What his return would mean for the darkness. We end not with a forecast, but with a reflection on what the Emperor's return means for the setting itself, because that is the question that the lore most carefully refuses to answer, and understanding why helps you understand what Warhammer 40,000 actually is. The setting is built around a very specific kind of darkness. Not empty nihilism, where nothing matters and nothing ever will. Not hopeless despair, where the outcome is fixed as total defeat. Something more specific and more interesting than either of those. The darkness of a universe, where the cost of doing what must be done is unimaginably high, and it has to be paid anyway. Where every victory is partial, and every hero is eventually ground down, and the line has to be held by the next person, and then the person after that, forever. Because the alternative is the end of everything. The Emperor on the throne is the central image of this. The greatest being humanity has ever produced, reduced to a broken ruin in a machine, unable to act directly, sustaining everything at the cost of everything else. Not triumphant, not defeated, enduring. This is what the setting is about, at its deepest level, not winning, but refusing to stop. His waking would change that image, not necessarily destroy it, but change it. Because the question is not really about the Emperor, it is about humanity. An Emperor who returns, finds the same species he has always been working with, shaped by 10,000 additional years of exactly the same pressures that shaped it before. The same tendency toward institutional self-preservation over genuine service, the same capacity for extraordinary heroism and extraordinary cruelty, sometimes from the same person in the same hour. The same ability to build something remarkable and then corrupt it in one generation and burn it down in two. An emperor who returns and tries to rebuild his vision would be asking something of humanity that humanity has shown. Repeatedly, it finds very difficult to serve something larger than itself without that service turning into an excuse to serve itself instead. The ecclesiarchy is a monument to this failure. So is the history of the High Lords. So is every war of apostasy and every period of corruption and every institution that began as an attempt to do something good and became, over time, a mechanism for the perpetuation of the people running it at the expense of what it was supposed to accomplish. The Emperor knows this about humanity. He has known it for 40,000 years. He built institutions with it in mind, tried to create structures that would resist corruption, tried to design systems that served their function rather than their administrators. And every single one of those systems became something he had not intended within a few thousand years of his imprisonment. Whether he could do better the second time is the question that remains open. Whether humanity, given the direct presence of the being it has been worshipping as a god for 10,000 years, would respond by actually trying to be what that being intended it to be, or whether it would respond by trying to manage him the way it manages everything else that is nominally above the political horizon. This is the question that the lore leaves open, with extraordinary deliberateness. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there is also, buried beneath that war, beneath the 10,000 years of accumulated weight and damage and sacrifice, a fragment of something the Emperor cast away in his most desperate hour, something that contains his hope, his love, his belief that humanity is worth the cost of protecting it, drifting in the warp, growing slowly, waiting for a moment when the conditions are right, waiting for an Emperor who remembers what it was all for. Whether that moment comes, and what it looks like when it does, is the most interesting question in a setting full of interesting questions. If you have sat with this for its full length, then you already know what kind of content this is. The kind that does not answer its own questions but sends you out with new ones, which is the only honest thing it can do with material this genuinely uncertain and this genuinely interesting. If you want more of this kind of lore, the slow, careful examination of the ideas underneath the armies and the battles, then subscribing is how you make sure you do not miss what comes next. Drop in the comments which Emperor you think wakes. The Star Child reunited and whole, the cold half without the warmth, the Dark King, or something else entirely. Some possibility that the lore hints at, and I have not fully accounted for. Because the community that cares about this deeply enough to think about it seriously is the best part of this whole thing. The Emperor protects. Perhaps soon, he will do it himself. End of script. Extended exploration. The Webway, the Astronomicon, and the transition problem. One of the dimensions of the Emperor's waking that tends to get compressed in most discussions is the sheer logistical nightmare of the transition period. Most people imagine the Emperor rising from the throne and immediately doing impressive things, fighting chaos gods, rallying space marines, reorganizing the Imperium with the authority of actual divine command. The reality, based on what we understand about what the throne is actually doing, is considerably more complicated and considerably more dangerous in the immediate term. Consider what happens to the Astronomicon the moment the Emperor's relationship with the Golden Throne changes. The Astronomicon is not simply a machine that the Emperor turns on. It is an enormously complex psychic system that draws on both the Emperor's will as its primary directing intelligence and the soul energy of the daily psyker sacrifices as its primary power source. The Emperor's consciousness within the throne provides the coherence, the directed signal, the specific frequency that navigators have calibrated their entire perceptive capability around for 10,000 years. The sacrificed psychers provide the raw energy that sustains the broadcast. If the Emperor's relationship with the throne changes if he withdraws from it, or if the nature of his presence within it shifts substantially, the Astronomicon's signal changes, not necessarily goes out. Changes. And the navigators who depend on that signal, who have been born and trained to perceive it as a fixed reference point in the immaterial sea, would need to recalibrate to the new signal. During the recalibration period, which could last days or weeks or longer, depending on the nature of the change, navigation would be unreliable in ways that range from inconvenient to catastrophic. Consider the ships currently in transit through the warp when this happens. There are, at any given moment, an almost uncountable number of Imperial vessels traversing the Imperium military ships, cargo haulers, passenger transports, the black ships themselves, the countless small craft that carry messages and people and goods between the Imperium's 100,000 worlds. Every one of these ships is being guided by a navigator using the Astronomicon as their primary reference. An Astronomicon that shifts unpredictably is, for a navigator mid-transit, roughly equivalent to a lighthouse, suddenly changing the pattern of its signal while a ship is in unfamiliar waters in the dark. Some ships would emerge safely from the warp without incident, navigators who happened to have already found the exit point they were aiming for, or whose distance from Terra meant the signal shift was subtle enough to compensate for. Others would have much worse outcomes. Vessels that were deep in the warp and dependent on the Astronomicon's guidance to find their way out would be in genuine danger of losing their bearing entirely. The warp does not forgive disorientation. A ship that cannot orient itself in the immaterium can drift for subjective days, while objective centuries pass. Some never emerge. The logistical implications of even a temporary disruption to the Astronomicon extend across the entire Imperium. Military campaigns that were depending on reinforcements arriving on specific timelines would find those timelines suddenly unreliable. Food shipments to hive worlds that cannot feed their own populations would be delayed. Medical supplies, military hardware, new orders from Terra, every supply chain in the Imperium runs, ultimately, on the reliability of warp navigation, and warp navigation runs on the Astronomicon's consistency. This is before we even address the webway gate beneath the palace. Whatever arrangement is made to seal that gate during the transition from the throne as life support to whatever comes next is going to have to be absolutely reliable from the first moment, because there is no margin for error. The daemonic presence that has been pushing against that seal for 10,000 years is vast and patient, and has never once stopped trying. A gap in the psychic coverage of the seal, even a brief gap, even one that lasts only seconds by objective reckoning, would be enough. Whatever comes through that gate in the first moments of an unsealed webway breach would make the daemonic incursions that the custodians have been fighting in the tunnels look like a warm-up exercise. The Grey Knights, the secret Space Marine chapter specifically created to fight demonic threats, the successors to Malkador's Knight-Errant program, the most psychically powerful Marines in existence, would need to be involved in any transition plan. Their capabilities are specifically designed for exactly this kind of contingency, but even Grey Knights have limits. The webway gate breach would represent a daemonic incursion at the heart of the most defended location in the Imperium, happening simultaneously with every other crisis the Emperor's waking produces, in a situation where every other defensive resource is also dealing with the most significant political and military upheaval in 10,000 years. The transition problem is what distinguishes a well-planned waking from an unplanned one. If the Emperor's recovery is gradual enough that preparations can be made if there is time to position Grey Knights in the tunnels, to develop alternative psychic anchors for the webway gate, to prepare the navigators for a shift in the Astronomican's character, to position political representatives at Terra so that the first communications about the Emperor's return come from controlled sources. Then the chaos is still enormous, but it is manageable chaos. If the Emperor simply wakes, if the throne fails catastrophically, and the process is sudden and uncontrolled, then everything happens at once with no preparation. And the initial days following the event would be characterized by simultaneous crises of such magnitude that even an awake Emperor might struggle to address them fast enough to prevent catastrophic loss. Extended exploration. The fate of the Astronomican Psykers. There is a dimension of the Emperor's return that almost never gets the attention it deserves in these discussions, and it is one that says something important about the moral weight of everything the Imperium has been doing in his name. 1,000 Psykers per day are sacrificed to sustain the Emperor and the Astronomican. That number has been quoted so many times in 41st Millennium lore that it has become background. It is the kind of fact that the setting presents with the grim matter-of-factness it uses for all of its most terrible realities, stated clearly, not dwelt on, moved past in favor of more immediately dramatic details. But these are people. Every single one of the Psykers who passes through the throne room is a human being with a name and a history. Most of them are gathered by the black ships, the vessels of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica that continuously patrol the Imperium, collecting newly emerged Psykers from the worlds where they appear. Many of those individuals were taken from their families at young ages. Because psychic ability tends to manifest before adulthood, and because an unsanctioned Psyker living in an ordinary community is a genuine threat that the Imperium takes seriously, they are brought to Terra, they are processed, and then, eventually, they are fed into the machine. Not all of them go directly to the throne. Some become astropaths, soul-bound to the Emperor in a ritual that connects their psychic essence to him and stabilizes their ability to communicate across interstellar distances. Some become sanctioned Psykers, trained and authorized to serve in Imperial military units. A small number of the most powerful and stable are inducted into organizations like the Grey Knights or the Scholastica Psychana. But the ones who are not strong enough for independent sanctioning, not suitable for the specific requirements of the astropathic core, not gifted in the particular ways that other specialized roles require. These are the ones who walk into the lower chambers and give everything they are to keep the lights on. If the Emperor wakes, this ends. Whatever the mechanism of his return, an Emperor who is sufficiently recovered to consciously operate is an Emperor who will know what has been done in his name for 10,000 years. He will know about the daily sacrifice the moment he is capable of knowing anything. He will feel the thousands of souls that have been processed through the machine he is connected to, will have been feeling them in whatever form of awareness he maintains, for the entire duration of his imprisonment. His reaction to this knowledge, to what has been done to maintain his presence in a form that could not act, would be one of the most significant emotional and political moments of his return. The Emperor cared about humanity. The whole point of everything he built was to protect and advance humanity. The fact that his protection has required the continuous destruction of human lives at a rate that over 10,000 years produces a number that might make the casualties of the entire Horus heresy look modest is something that he would have to reckon with. Would he give it context and move forward? Would he experience it as tragedy but accept it as the cost of what was necessary? Or would he find this intolerable with the knowledge of what his survival cost, catalyze a determination to find a different solution faster than anything else could? The immediate cessation of the Psyker sacrifice would be one of his first likely orders, if he is capable of giving orders, and if the practical requirements of the Astronomican can be addressed in some other way. But this creates its own cascade of consequences. Thousands of Psykers who were being collected and processed for this purpose would suddenly need to be redirected. The black ships that continuously travel the Imperium gathering them would need new mandates. The entire infrastructure of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica that has been organized around this function for 10,000 years would need to be restructured, and the Astronomican's power requirements do not simply disappear. If the Emperor is sustaining it from his own power, if a recovered Emperor can maintain the beacon through his own psychic will, without the supplemental soul energy, then the sacrifice becomes unnecessary. But this requires an Emperor who is sufficiently recovered to do this, and the transition period between the throne fails and the Emperor is self-sustaining is exactly the window when the Astronomicon is most vulnerable. Extended exploration. Allies humanity never properly used. One of the quieter implications of the Emperor's waking one that gets very little attention because it requires taking seriously certain lore that has been treated as peripheral is the possibility of alliances that have never been fully developed because no one in the Imperium has had the authority or the perspective to make them work. The Aeldari relationship with humanity has always been one of mutual necessity, shadowed by mutual distrust. The craft world Aeldari have, on multiple occasions, provided assistance to Imperial forces in situations where the alternative was outcomes worse for both parties. The Ynnari have made more explicit overtures toward cooperation in recent years, but the structural barriers to anything approaching a genuine alliance have been enormous. The Imperium's xenophobic ideology, which considers cooperation with alien species heretical in most interpretations of the Imperial Creed. The Aeldari's own tendency to treat humanity as a younger and not particularly wise species to be guided or manipulated rather than partnered with, and the absence of anyone on the human side with sufficient authority and sufficient knowledge of the stakes to override the ideology. The Emperor knows the Aeldari in ways that no other living human does. He has been alive since before the fall of their civilization. He has been fighting, in his own way, the same enemies they have been fighting for 60,000 years. He understands the warp's nature in ways that the Aeldari seers understand it from the other side, two different traditions of deep knowledge about the same fundamental reality. There are things each side knows that the other does not, and the combination of those things might produce capabilities that neither possesses independently. An emperor who wakes and reaches out to the craft world Aeldari, who speaks to Eldrad Ulthrin or the Phoenix Lords or whoever survives, as the most senior representatives of Aeldari experience as an equal rather than as a representative of a species that the Aeldari condescend to assist when their own interests require it would be a different kind of conversation. The Emperor predates most of the Aeldari's surviving leadership. The conversations he could have with beings who knew the galaxy before the fall, who remember what was lost and what might be rebuilt, are conversations that have no equivalent anywhere else. Similarly, with the Ynnari and the question of Iniad. The Aeldari god of the dead has been in the process of being born for decades now, slowly growing as Aeldari souls are fed into it rather than lost to Slaanesh. The Ynnari's project to complete Ynead's birth as a solution to the Slaanesh problem, to give the Aeldari a god capable of protecting their souls in a way that the fallen Aeldari gods no longer can, is one that has implications for the broader galactic balance that the Emperor, uniquely among human beings, might be positioned to understand and potentially assist with. The Necron question is stranger and more speculative. The Silent King's return to the galaxy represents a being of extraordinary age and perspective and pragmatism, a figure who ruled the galaxy long before humanity was a species, and who gave up his own soul to save his people from the Satan, and who has spent the millennia since then working to find a solution to what that decision cost. The Tyranid threat that both humanity and the Necrons face is real enough that certain Necron dynasties have already cooperated with Imperial forces in specific tactical situations. Whether this could become something more strategic, more deliberate, more organized, and whether the Emperor's presence provides the credibility and authority on the human side to make such cooperation work, is a question the lore has been setting up for years without yet answering. Extended exploration. What chaos has prepared. The Chaos Gods are not passive. They have been preparing for the Emperor's potential return with the kind of long-term strategic patience that only beings who experience time differently from mortals can sustain. Abaddon the Despoiler's 13 Black Crusades have been the most obvious expression of the Long War's prosecution, but they have not been the totality of it. The fall of Cadia and the birth of the Great Rift changed the strategic landscape of the galaxy in ways that were not accidental. The Cicatrix Maledictum was not simply the collateral damage of Chaos's assault, it was a restructuring of the battlefield. The division of the Imperium in two, the permanent immaterial storm that makes communication and transit between Imperium Sanctus and Imperium Nihilus unreliable, and dangerous. The increased vulnerability of worlds near the rift to demonic incursion, all of this serves Chaos's interests by fragmenting humanity's ability to respond coherently to any single threat. An emperor who wakes into this restructured galaxy faces a different strategic situation than the one he fell from. In the 30th millennium, the Imperium's territory was a single coherent entity with reliable warp lanes and a functioning astronomicon. In the 42nd millennium, it is effectively two separate regions that have difficulty coordinating with each other, surrounded on all sides by hostile forces and divided internally by the rift itself. The Chaos forces would immediately redirect toward Terra when word of the Emperor's waking spread. But more interesting than the direct assault, which the defenses of the Sol system and the Adeptus Custodes are designed to handle in various configurations, is the indirect pressure. Chaos's greatest strategic asset has never been direct battle. It has been the corruption of institutions, the manipulation of individuals within systems, the long, slow erosion of what holds civilization together from the inside. The traitor legions, specifically, would be a complex factor. These are beings who were once space marines, some of them born in the Great Crusade era, who have survived 10,000 years in the Eye of Terror through a combination of Chaos's gifts and sheer brutal survival instinct. Many of them have been fighting the same war for their entire remembered existence. The Word-bearers, who began as loyal servants of the Emperor and were driven to chaos by what felt to them like a profound betrayal of what they genuinely believed, have a relationship with the Emperor's return that is the most psychologically interesting of any of the traitor legions. Lorgar, if he still exists in some form in the Eye of Terror, might be the strangest case of all. He worshipped the Emperor. He built temples to him. He was publicly humiliated and driven to the arms of the very gods his faith had been reaching for, and that humiliation became the seed of the religion that is now the official faith of the Imperium. An emperor who wakes might find that among the most unexpected things waiting for him is a conversation that neither of them wanted to have, about what faith actually means and what it costs when it is expressed in the wrong direction. The Emperor might also find that some Chaos Space Marines, not many, but some, those who retained the most of what they were before the corruption took hold, might be reachable in ways that the 10,000-year-old designations of traitor do not fully capture. The Iron Hands, who turn to chaos but retain their mechanical, philosophical framework. The handful of Night Lords, who fight for personal reasons rather than devotion to the dark gods. The Emperor is, in the lore, one of the few beings with the psychic capability and the genuine understanding of each individual Primarch's creation to potentially speak to what remains of the humanity in those corrupted figures. Whether any of them could be reclaimed, or whether 10 millennia of immersion in the Eye of Terror has made that question irrelevant, is something the Emperor would have to determine. But the attempt, if made, would itself be historically unprecedented. Extended exploration, the long view, what humanity could become. We began with the Emperor in the past. We end with him looking toward the future, because that is where the real stakes of his return exist. The Emperor has always known something about humanity that he has rarely stated plainly, because stating it plainly creates pressures he was not ready for humanity to face. Humanity is evolving, not slowly, in the geological sense that evolution usually operates on, but rapidly, at the pace that psychic awakening creates when it occurs across a species that already has the biological substrate for it. Humanity in the 41st millennium is not the humanity of the 30th. It has been producing more psychers in each generation than the generation before. The psychic awakening that followed the birth of the Great Rift accelerated this dramatically psyker births across the Imperium, increased by orders of magnitude in a very short period. New kinds of psychic abilities manifested in populations that had never shown them before. The categories that the Adeptus Astra Telepathica used to classify and sort psychers proved inadequate to what was emerging. This is what the Emperor built toward. Not immediately, not in the 31st millennium, when humanity was not ready, but eventually. The goal was always a humanity that had evolved sufficiently as a psychic species to exist in the galaxy with full awareness of the warp, to use that awareness without being destroyed by it, to be partners in the management of their own destiny, rather than subjects of a protection they could not understand. The path between where humanity is and where it needs to be is still very long. The psychic awakening was a beginning, not an arrival. But it was a beginning that the Emperor, looking at his species after 10,000 years of watching it from inside the throne's strange partial awareness, might recognize as exactly what he was waiting for. Not the signal that humanity was ready, the signal that humanity was starting. What he might do with that information, how he might shape the next phase of human evolution if he has the freedom to act, is perhaps the most profound question his return raises. Not how does he stop the chaos threat, or how does he reorganize the Imperium, but what does he do with the possibility that everything that was supposed to happen is still possible, just delayed by 10,000 years and requiring an approach adapted to what those 10,000 years produced? The human species that the Emperor finds waiting for him in the 41st millennium is not what he planned for. It is more damaged, more corrupted, more dependent, more afraid. But it is also something his original vision did not account for. It is a species that has survived things that should have destroyed it, that has held a line against the entirety of the galaxy's darkness, using faith and stubbornness, and the particular human tendency to refuse to accept the logical outcome when the logical outcome is unacceptable. There is something in that worth building on, something that the Emperor, who knows humanity better than anyone alive and loves it more than even he would comfortably admit, would recognize immediately. Whether he has the time, the freedom, the support, and the version of himself necessary to do that building is the question that the lore has been circling for decades. The Emperor's return is the most consequential event the 41st millennium could produce. Not necessarily for better, not necessarily for worse, but definitively for different. The Imperium that exists at the end of a successful Emperor waking scenario is not the Imperium that exists now, and the galaxy that exists at the end of it is not the galaxy that exists now. And in a setting that has spent 40 years exploring what it means to hold the line without hope of meaningful victory, that possibility is perhaps the strangest and most remarkable thing of all. Not hope, exactly. The 41st millennium does not traffic in hope as a commodity, something more durable than hope, something more complicated than triumph. The possibility, not the certainty, not the guarantee, but the genuine possibility that what was lost can be found again, and that the finding of it changes not just the outcome, but the nature of the question itself. The Emperor is waiting. The galaxy is waiting. Whatever comes next has been 10,000 years in the making. End of script. Extended exploration. The Inquisition's problem. Heresy without a heretic. The Inquisition deserves its own extended treatment in any serious exploration of what happens if the Emperor wakes, because its situation is perhaps the most internally contradictory of any major imperial institution. The Inquisition exists to protect the Imperium from threats that come from within, from heresy, from chaos corruption, from Xenos influence, from the countless ways that the Imperium's enemies work to undermine it without open assault. Its authority to investigate and eliminate those threats is effectively unlimited, bounded only by the Inquisition's own internal checks and the theoretical oversight of the Emperor's will, as expressed through the institutional structures of Terra. Its foundational mandate is protecting the Emperor's Imperium from corruption in all its forms. An active Emperor who does not need the Inquisition to interpret his will, who can express his will directly, would transform the Inquisition from an organization with de facto autonomous authority into one that has a clear, superior it answers to. In theory, this is what the Inquisition always was. In practice, for 10,000 years of the Emperor's silence, the Inquisition has functioned as a self-directing organization that determines its own mandate based on its own interpretation of what the Emperor would want. The Inquisition has three major internal factions, the Ordos that deal with the three main categories of threat. The Ordo Malleus, which fights demonic threats. The Ordo Xenos, which investigates alien dangers and works to neutralize them. And the Ordo Hereticus, which hunts heretics and corruption within the Imperium's own institutions. Each has its own culture, its own sub-factions, its own schools of thought about how best to pursue its mandate. Within each Ordo, there are additionally significant divisions between the Puritan factions, those who believe in dealing with threats through absolute methods, burning everything associated with chaos or xenotech, never using the tools of the enemy and the radical factions, who believe that understanding and sometimes wielding the weapons and knowledge of the enemy is necessary to fight them effectively. This internal political division has produced genuine civil wars within the Inquisition at various points in its history. An emperor who wakes would immediately have an opinion about many of the methods both Puritans and radicals have been using for 10,000 years. He would have opinions about exterminatus, the destruction of an entire planet's population when it has been deemed too compromised to save. He would have opinions about the Inquisition's historical pattern of destroying planets and populations based on incomplete information, making the maximum irreversible choice out of fear of a lesser irreversible outcome. He would have opinions about the ways radical inquisitors have used demonic possession, xenotech, and other proscribed tools in service of goals they determined to be sufficiently important to justify the risk. Some of those opinions would align with existing inquisitorial doctrine. Others would directly contradict it. And the Inquisition's response to being told that its practices are wrong by the being it was created to serve would depend enormously on which inquisitors received the information and through what channels, because the Inquisition is one of the organizations with the most sophisticated apparatus for managing and selectively presenting information in ways that serve its purposes. There is a specific sub-problem that the Ordo Hereticus faces that deserves particular attention. The definition of heresy is about to become extremely complicated. For 10,000 years, heresy against the imperial creed denial of the emperor's divinity, refusal to participate in imperial worship, advocacy of alternative philosophical frameworks has been prosecutable by death. The Ordo Hereticus exists in part to identify and eliminate heretics from within the Imperium's own population. It has vast experience with this work. Now consider what it means when the emperor wakes and says, with the authority of actual divinity speaking directly, "I am not a god and never wanted to be worshipped." Every person who has been executed for denying the emperor's divinity over the past 8,000 years has been killed for saying something that turned out to be factually accurate. Every hereticus inquisitor who ordered those deaths has, in retrospect, been enforcing a doctrine that the emperor himself would repudiate. Every ecclesiarchal court that convicted individuals of heresy for insufficient piety has been operating on the wrong premise. The Ordo Hereticus does not have a protocol for the foundational premise of everything we enforce turns out to be wrong. No institution does. The psychological and organizational crisis this produces in an order that has defined heresy in a specific way for 8,000 years and has the blood of heresy's prosecution on its hands across countless generations of agents would be enormous and deeply destabilizing. Some hereticus inquisitors would immediately reorient, would recognize that their mandate is to protect humanity from corruption, that the specific doctrinal content of the imperial creed is secondary to that underlying mandate, and would begin the process of adapting their practices to whatever the emperor indicates he actually wants from them. These would be the most flexible and pragmatic individuals in the organization. Others would double down, would classify the emperor's apparent rejection of the doctrine as itself a sign of corruption or impersonation, would begin investigating the circumstances of the emperor's waking for signs of chaos influence, would prosecute anyone who publicly agreed with what the emperor was saying as a heretic for spreading doctrine that contradicts the established imperial creed, right up until the point where that becomes untenable, and possibly past that point in certain locations where the Ordo Hereticus's authority is effectively unchecked. The Inquisition's internal civil war, following the emperor's return, could be as damaging in some regions as the external threats, because it would happen within the very institutions that are supposed to be defending against those threats. Extended exploration, Space Marines, and their complicated legacies. The Space Marines of the 41st millennium are not the Space Marine legions of the Great Crusade. They have been reorganized, restructured, divided, and reorganized again over 10,000 years. The Codex Astartes, written by Guilliman after the heresy, broke the old legions into chapters of roughly 1,000 Marines each, preventing any single Primarch or chapter master from commanding the kind of force that had made the heresy possible. This was wise, politically. It was also a kind of loss, militarily and culturally, and the Space Marines themselves have complex feelings about it that vary enormously by chapter. The Emperor would encounter a space marine culture that has developed in very particular directions during his absence. The chapters have their own traditions, their own theologies in most cases, their own heroes who have been elevated to chapter saints. They revere their founding primarchs, the ones who survived to see chapters founded in their name, with an intensity that borders on the religious devotion the Emperor specifically did not want. When the Emperor meets the Space Marines of the 41st millennium, if he meets them, if he has the freedom to do so, he will find warriors who are everything he built them to be, in terms of capability and dedication, and who have built that capability and dedication on a cultural foundation that he would recognize as a departure from his original design. The Imperial Fists have become deeply focused on the nature of duty as an absolute. The Space Wolves have developed their own mythology around Russ and the Fenrisian traditions. The Blood Angels carry the curse of Sanguinius's death in their gene seed, and the chapters descended from them manage that curse in different ways, some more successfully than others. The Dark Angels carry their secret, still, after all this time. The Primaris Space Marines, the new generation that Guillemot has been seeding through the existing chapters, represent something the Emperor would find interesting and possibly surprising. Call developed them over 10,000 years, working from the Emperor's original genetic templates, enhanced beyond what the first generation of Astartes achieved. They are better soldiers in the technical sense. They are also products of a very different design philosophy developed in secret by a tech priest over a geological timescale, without the Emperor's direct involvement. Without the Primarchs' genetic templates as mediators between the Emperor's design and the final product, the Emperor would have opinions about this. Call worked from the Emperor's own designs, in good faith, and produced something impressive. But the Emperor's original approach to creating Space Marines was intensely personal. Each legion reflected something of the Primarch, whose genetic template was its foundation, and each Primarch reflected something of the Emperor himself. The Primaris don't have that lineage in the same way. They are improvements on a design, without the original design's deepest intention. This is not to say they are inferior. The evidence suggests the opposite in most tactical measures. But there is a question about whether soldiers who are better at being soldiers are also better at being whatever the Emperor originally intended the Space Marines to be, which was something more nuanced than the most effective possible killers. The Emperor would also need to reckon with the chapters that have gone wrong over 10,000 years. The chapters that have been declared excommunicate traitoris. The chapters that have fallen to chaos, in whole or in part. The chapters whose gene seed has degraded in ways that produce dangerous instabilities, who are kept operational because the Imperium cannot afford to lose any fighting capacity, but who represent ongoing problems that no one has adequately solved. And most specifically, he would need to reckon with what happened to the Primarchs who fell. Not all of them are simply gone. Fulgrim has ascended to daemonhood and rules in the Eye of Terror. Angron has ascended similarly, Mortarion. Magnus, who walks between the warp and real space in ways that make his status ambiguous. Perturabo. Lorgar. These are the Emperor's sons, still existing in some form, still carrying within them something of the genetic and spiritual legacy of what he created, transformed by 10,000 years of service to the ruinous powers into something he might barely recognize. The question of whether the Emperor could or would attempt to reach these fallen sons, whether there is anything left to reach, whether the attempt would be suicidal even for him, whether it would produce anything worth the cost, is one of the most loaded questions his return raises. Because he knows these individuals better than anyone. He created them. He understood them in ways that even they did not fully understand themselves. If there is anything left of who they were, he might be the only being in existence who could find it. Extended exploration. The Question Games Workshop will never fully answer. There is something important to say about why the Emperor's return has been the most discussed topic in the Warhammer 40,000 community for decades, while Games Workshop has never resolved it, and why that creative decision is actually correct. The tension at the heart of the 41st millennium setting is between the grimdark nature of the world, the sense that this is a universe where things are genuinely terrible and the trajectory is genuinely dark, and the persistent presence of heroism, devotion, and the stubborn human tendency to fight for things that matter even when the fight seems hopeless. The setting works because of this tension. If it was pure nihilism, There would be no reason to care about any character or faction. If it was optimistic, there would be no weight to the victories. The Emperor on the throne represents this tension in its most concentrated form. He is the greatest hero in human history, made useless by the consequences of a war he technically won. He is the object of worship for a religion he never wanted, sustained by sacrifices he never authorized, protecting an imperium that has become everything he opposed. He is simultaneously the most important being alive and the most functionally constrained. He is hope and hopelessness, expressed in the same image. His waking resolves the tension, and resolution is the end of productive ambiguity. If he wakes and saves the day, the setting moves from grim-dark endurance to something more conventional. The hero returns. Things get better. The narrative has a direction toward improvement rather than the endless present tense of holding the line. Many fans would love this. It would change the tone of everything in ways that some would experience as a relief, and others would experience as a betrayal of what made the setting interesting. If he wakes and makes things worse, if the Dark King emerges, if the civil war he triggers kills more people than the enemies he was supposed to protect against, if the political chaos of his return accelerates the Imperium's decline, then the setting moves from grimdark endurance to something more purely catastrophic. The last hope fails. The thing that was supposed to save humanity is the thing that ends it. This would be thematically consistent in a very dark way, but it removes a certain kind of narrative possibility permanently. Games Workshop has navigated this by advancing the setting in ways that approach the question without resolving it. Cadia fell. The Great Rift opened. Guilliman returned. The Lion returned. The lore has moved significantly in the direction of escalation and change, but the Emperor on the throne remains. The question remains open. This is actually the correct creative decision, because the open question is the generative one. Every fan who speculates about what the Emperor's return would mean, every bit of imagination and engagement and emotional investment in the answer exists because the question has not been closed. The moment it is closed, a specific kind of imaginative engagement ends. The Emperor's perpetual almost return, always implied, always building, never resolved, is what keeps the setting's most fundamental question alive. And as long as that question is alive, the setting generates exactly the kind of engagement that makes people spend their time exploring it in videos like this one, which does not mean the answer does not matter. The answer matters enormously. The lore has been giving us pieces of it for years, in the Siege of Terra novels, and in the Dark Imperium series, and in the Psychic Awakening books, and in every piece of canon that touches on the Emperor's current state. The pieces are there. They just have not been assembled into a final image. Maybe they never will be. Maybe the question will remain the most productive, unanswered question in the history of speculative fiction. Endlessly generative, endlessly interesting, holding space for every interpretation while committing to none. Or maybe, one day, there will be a novel or a codex or a campaign book that opens with a single image, a pair of eyes, open for the first time in 10,000 years, looking out at a galaxy that desperately needs what they see. Until then, we have the question. We have the lore that surrounds it. We have everything it implies and everything it promises and everything it threatens. And honestly, for a community that loves sitting with complicated ideas in the quiet hours of the evening, that might be exactly enough. Take a moment, wherever you are right now, and leave a comment. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is. Tell me which of the three emperors you think is most likely to wake the whole emperor, the cold half-soul, or the Dark King. Tell me what you think the first thing he says would be, or what the first thing he does would be, or what the first institution to fall apart under the weight of his return would be. Because this is exactly the kind of question that deserves a conversation, not just an answer. Subscribe if you want more of this. More lore, more exploration, more long-form sitting with the ideas that make this setting genuinely unlike anything else in the history of speculative worlds. It means more than you know. The Emperor protects, or at least that is what we are all hoping.